taxes on Chinese electric vehicles.
Canada, it's picking a battle with China. Ottawa has imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, that's electric vehicles.
To the federal government's ongoing trade dispute with China, a new Angus Reid Institute survey suggests Canadians are in favor of cutting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.
Factories are slowing, fields are falling quiet, and tension is spreading from boardrooms to barns. Canada's move to block cheap Chinese electric vehicles was meant to protect its own, but the backlash has cut far deeper than expected. Beijing hit back with punishing tariffs on Canadian canola, leaving farmers staring at collapsing prices and uncertain futures. Now the pressure is building in Ottawa. Leaders are split, industries are restless, and the public is growing uneasy. How far can Canada push this standoff before the cost becomes too high, and what happens if the gamble fails? Canada's trade gamble began with high hopes, but quickly spiraled into a storm that few saw coming. In late 2024, Ottawa moved forward with a sweeping 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles, a decision meant to protect homegrown automakers from being overwhelmed by China's aggressive EV expansion. The idea was to carve out breathing space for local manufacturers, giving them time to strengthen production and compete on a global scale. Canadian leaders argued that China's dominance came from state subsidies rather than fair competition, and without intervention, domestic factories risked being buried under a flood of cheap imports. At first, the policy was celebrated as a bold stand for economic independence, but trade disputes rarely stay one-sided. Within months, China struck back with precision. Beijing imposed heavy tariffs on some of Canada's most critical agricultural exports, cutting deep into the heart of the prairie economy. Canola, Canada's golden crop, was hit with a punishing 75.8% duty, while peas and other grains were caught in the crossfire. It was a calculated response aimed squarely at the country's breadbasket, where thousands of farmers depend on Chinese markets to keep their operations afloat. What started as a fight to protect cars had turned into an economic collision that left farmers and automakers tangled in the same web of fallout. Ottawa initially stood firm. The 100% tariff, officials said, was non-negotiable. It was the price of protecting Canada's long-term future in the electric vehicle race. But as months passed, the economic toll became harder to ignore. Farm incomes began to sink. Local grain elevators overflowed with unsold crops. The very regions that helped feed the country were now facing financial collapse. Across Saskatchewan and Alberta, farmers gathered in community halls and town meetings, demanding action. They warned that without access to China, they had no future. Their message cut through the political noise because it came with numbers that could not be dismissed. The canola sector alone generates more than $40 billion annually and supports hundreds of thousands of jobs. That kind of pressure could not be contained for long. Soon, cracks began to appear in the government's resolve. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe made headlines when he flew to Beijing, hoping to open back channels and rebuild ties. At first, his move was criticized as a political stunt, but it soon drew surprising approval from Prime Minister Mark Carney, signaling that Ottawa's hardline approach might be softening. Not long after, Foreign Minister Melanie Joly admitted that the tariff was under review, hinting that Canada could strengthen trade with Japan, South Korea, and Europe to cushion the blow. Agriculture Minister Heath MacDonald went a step further, suggesting that the tariff itself might need adjustment. Together, their remarks marked a turning point, from defending the policy to finding a way to manage its damage. Yet, while diplomats and politicians debated, the very industry meant to benefit from the tariff began to show cracks of its own. The electric vehicle market, once a source of national pride, started to falter under the weight of isolation. By mid-2025, EV sales had fallen nearly 40% compared to the previous year. What had once been a booming sector now faced empty showrooms and rising frustration from consumers. Incentive programs were disappearing fast. British Columbia scrapped its rebate entirely, while Quebec barely kept its own after public outrage. Most new models were too expensive to qualify for federal incentives, making electric cars unaffordable for the average buyer. Chinese manufacturers, known for low-cost EVs packed with cutting-edge technology, could have filled the gap, but the tariff locked them out, shrinking consumer options and slowing progress toward Canada's goal of zero-emission transportation. The government quietly delayed its 2026 mandate on zero-emission sales, and temporary financial aid was offered to struggling automakers. What was intended as a defense for growth had become a drag on innovation. While automakers grappled with plummeting sales, prairie farmers continued to bear the weight of China's retaliation. Across the vast plains of Saskatchewan and Alberta, farmers watched in disbelief as their markets evaporated. The 75.8% Chinese tariff didn't just dent profits, it shut off access to their biggest buyer. Canola prices tumbled, futures markets lost confidence, and silos filled with grain that no one could sell. For many rural communities, canola isn't simply a commodity, it's the backbone of the local economy. From small equipment dealers to trucking companies, every part of the system depends on that trade flow. Losing it meant more than financial loss. It meant uncertainty about survival. Ottawa pledged support, but patience wore thin. Words and promises couldn't pay off loans or move millions of unsold bushels. Agriculture Minister Keith MacDonald spoke of relief plans, while the Prime Minister continued to reference Mo's outreach in Beijing as a sign of progress. But among farmers, frustration turned into fury. Many believed their livelihoods had been sacrificed to protect automakers hundreds of miles away. Prairie premiers demanded financial help, yet what farmers truly wanted wasn't a bailout. It was their market back. Each month without resolution deepened the economic wounds, creating a divide that stretched across Canada's provinces. As frustration grew, Ottawa faced a crucial decision: double down or pivot. Removing the tariff entirely could bring immediate relief. It would reopen the Chinese market to farmers and bring EV prices back within reach for consumers. The auto industry could recover some balance, and the agricultural sector could breathe again. But such a reversal carried its own risks. Domestic automakers, already struggling to compete with American and Asian giants, feared being overwhelmed by cheap Chinese imports. On the other hand, keeping the tariff intact risked further losses and growing public backlash. The government was trapped between protecting industry and saving livelihoods. Amid the debate, a third path began to take shape. Rather than a full retreat or complete resistance, Canada could opt for a middle ground, a selective rollback paired with new trade partnerships. Lowering tariffs on specific EV models while negotiating better access for Canadian crops could soften the blow. Ottawa could also use tariff relief as leverage, pushing for Chinese automakers to invest in local assembly plants or battery facilities. Such deals could create jobs at home, restore agricultural exports, and reduce dependence on one market. Foreign Minister Joly hinted at this kind of strategy, emphasizing that any concession should bring clear gains for Canada's economy. But even a balanced approach came with political turbulence. Ontario's influential auto unions warned that allowing Chinese EVs could threaten local jobs. Opposition parties accused the government of bowing to pressure, and analysts questioned whether Beijing would negotiate in good faith. Still, the potential benefits were difficult to overlook. Reopening trade would boost farm incomes, revive consumer confidence, and strengthen the EV sector through competition. The challenge lay in timing and diplomacy, how to move without appearing weak, and how to balance two powerful but conflicting interests. By the fall of 2025, it was clear that Canada's economic crossroads was no longer theoretical. Every decision carried visible consequences. Holding firm meant more layoffs, more lost exports, and a growing sense of instability. Pivoting toward compromise offered a chance to recover, but required political courage and careful negotiation. The divide between protection and progress had never been thinner. Some economists now argue that the policy accomplished its short-term goal. It bought time for Canadian automakers to adjust. But that time hasn't led to transformation. Factories remain behind in technology, EV adoption has slowed, and farmers continue to absorb losses that threaten to reshape rural Canada. The government's next move could define whether this period is remembered as a misstep or a turning point. A smarter path forward might link tariff relief to concrete results, renewed access to China's markets, commitments from automakers to build and innovate domestically, and partnerships with allies like Japan and South Korea to diversify trade and supply chains. By turning a trade dispute into a broader industrial strategy, Canada could emerge stronger and more self-reliant. But handled poorly, this standoff could leave deep scars, economic divisions that linger for decades. Now, the future depends on how Ottawa chooses to act. Whether it leans toward caution or compromise, the consequences will ripple across the country, from auto plants in Ontario to the canola fields of Saskatchewan. The choice will determine not only Canada's position in global trade, but also the livelihoods of those caught in the middle. The balance between recovery and resilience hangs in the air, and its outcome will be felt from factory floors to farming towns alike. Moreover, in the early months of 2025, the relationship between Washington and Ottawa took a turn few expected. The tone from the White House shifted from rivalry to outright hostility. President Donald Trump's comments about Canada no longer sounded like campaign bluster, but like deliberate provocation. He mocked Canadian sovereignty, claiming the country would be better off as America's 51st state. Within weeks, his administration followed those words with sweeping 35% tariffs on nearly every Canadian export. They weren't bargaining tools or economic safeguards, they were punishment. Then came the accusations that Canada was fueling America's fentanyl crisis, a claim that U.S. officials themselves had already contradicted. Each insult and policy move landed like a strike aimed not at trade, but at pride. For decades, the bond between the two countries had been one of the strongest in the world, built on trust, shared values, and open trade. Now, that friendship was fraying under the weight of politics. The tariffs bit hard, and the rhetoric burned deeper.